Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, I did a presentation where I talked about optimizing NPK for tomatoes. And during that session, Marion asked whether or not this could be true for other things as well. So I did some research and I found, yes, indeed, it is true that you can optimize these things, NPK, for various crops. NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These three elements constitute the macronutrients for plants. Macro means that these are the nutrients that are used in the largest quantities by growing plants. And if you look at a package of fertilizer, you will see that these typically are available in 10, 20, 30% each, and everything else is in very tiny amounts. That's because they're only needed in tiny amounts. So these are the things that influence plant growth the most. Presentation, I talked about coming across something called the Haifa group. And I was very impressed by the material on their site. And if you look at their home page down across the bottom here, you will see that they have segments for many different fruits and vegetables. And there's a lot of detail. There's more detail that I am going to show in this presentation. But the main point about these people is that they seem to have done a lot of scientific work on this. And here's the chart that I showed a few weeks ago regarding tomatoes. And what we saw on this chart is that during the flowering and fruiting stage and during the harvest stage, tomatoes require more potassium than nitrogen, and they require more nitrogen than phosphorus. I was in Lowe's one day and happened to be looking at the plant food that they have available. And when I read the back of this particular fertilizer that they produce, and I noticed that they do have a ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that is fairly close to the needs of the plants. It's just a little bit shy on the potassium end. And I had previously done some research that turned up this particular food, Jack's Classic, which has 12% nitrogen, 15% phosphorus, and 30% potassium. So it occurred to me that by mixing these two fertilizers, off-the-shelf fertilizers, you could end up with a very nice ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. In this case, 18, 11, and 23, averaging the values for these two fertilizers. Now, along with the macronutrients, plants do require a variety of micronutrients, and sometimes the commercial products are a little bit short on these. So I do advocate the use of something like this product, which is generally used in hydroponics, but which can add the micronutrients that you need for healthy plants that will be more flavorful and nutritious for you. So continuing with how to manage for different plants, in that same Haifa group, I found that in terms of peppers, we saw the same general sort of pattern. And what's going on with the potassium in this case is this first hump here on this curve is the first harvest, and then it kind of falls off. And then for a second harvest, which peppers can produce, you get another need for increased potassium. Similarly, in their section on cucumbers, I found this chart. And if you look at the bottom here, you will see that there again, for nitrogen greater than phosphorus and potassium greater than nitrogen. When we move on to potatoes, we find the same thing happening when potatoes are bulking up their particular fruit. And with strawberry, we basically saw the same pattern. Now it does vary during the life cycle of the strawberry, but by the end, you are back to more nitrogen than phosphorus and more potassium than nitrogen. And with corn, the same thing holds true. Question comes up as to what we can do for greens. Greens are very important for a variety of reasons. They are very nutritious and necessary for our health. And to me, a more important thing about greens is that many of them are cold tolerant. And where I live in California, I can grow these things year round. And in colder parts of the country, you can grow these in cold frames and greenhouses or indoors if necessary. Now, the Haifa group had this example of lettuce, and we see that here again at the bottom here, during the later stages of the lettuce life cycle, when we are harvesting lettuce, we have that same pattern: nitrogen greater than phosphorus, potassium greater than nitrogen. What about the other greens that we commonly grow? I came across this country called Greenway Biotech that has a lettuce fertilizer that is capable for all types of greens, such as kale, microgreens, broccoli, collard, spinach, cabbage, beet greens, watercress, lettuce, Swiss chard, arugula, endive, bok choy, and turnip greens. So here we have a commercial off-the-shelf product that you could buy for your greens. At the same time, we already looked at this Jack's Classic, which basically has a ratio that is in the right direction for this and could probably be used for a lot of greens. And the nice thing about this is that if you buy the Miracle-Gro All-Purpose and this food, then you can use them singly or in combination to get pretty much ideal ratios. And here again, micronutrients are recommended. What about flowers? Well, when I first started to learn about flower food, the NPK ratio of commonly sold flower foods is 10-20-10. But as a result of some of my research, I am now finding that in the 21st century, a better ratio is 20-10-20. 20 nitrogen, 10 phosphorus, 20 potassium. What about nuts? Well, basically, it's the same thing. It's a little bit different, where you have, of course, nitrogen greater than phosphorus and potassium not quite as much as the nitrogen. So you can probably still just use that blend and be just fine. Now, along with macronutrients and micronutrients, plants and people also need a variety of trace minerals. For instance, we need about 200 micrograms of selenium per day to carry out various processes in our body. And liquid seaweed is probably one of the places where you can get the trace minerals that plants and you need. These are soluble fertilizers, so I think it's important to fertilize after watering to avoid leaching below the root level. And drip irrigation with a timer is the best way to do frequent shallow watering for plants that are in the ground. How much water do you need to make sure the roots have what they need? Well, in transplants, they have roots that are 2 to 6 inches deep. And in mature plants, they typically have roots that are about 18 inches deep and sometimes deeper. So this is the depth at which you need to have, moisture in your soil. Now, in a previous video, I talked about using a soil moisture probe similar to this for doing that measurement. That probe had an 8.5-inch spike, and this probe, for a few dollars more, has a 12.5-inch spike. So this lets you measure the ground deeper than the other one. And if you really want to go down to that 18-inch level or even lower for quite a few more dollars, like $68 versus $15, you can get this long stem tool. But in either case, I think it's important to do this kind of measuring. On my particular probe, I put a piece of black tape at 4 inches above the end of the probe. And what I'm doing is I will stick that down into my pots. And when I see that the needle is down near the bottom of the moist zone and close to the dry zone at the 4-inch depth, then I know I need to water. By doing this from time to time, you will probably get a sense for what your soil needs in order to provide adequate moisture for the plants. In a previous video about managing pH, I talked about using things like limestone and sulfur amendments in order to manage the pH in your soil, and this can be done. I do think that it is kind of a slow and uncertain way of doing it. So I really think that you should use things like this, which are basically used in hydroponics because they are soluble and they will have an instant effect. Now, in terms of actual usage, what I'm thinking is that, let's say that you test your soil and it comes up with a pH of 7, and you want to have it at a pH of 5 based on our previous discussion, you may want to mix up like 5 gallons of your fertilizer, measure the pH, and then adjust the pH down in this case until it's perhaps down around 6, so that by the time you put it on your soil, you will hopefully average out to the 6.5 range that you want.